In the summer of 1944, Normandy's ancient terrain presented the U.S. Army with a problem no one had foreseen. The hedgerows of the French countryside, known as bocage, were not simple hedges, but centuries-old earthworks reinforced by thick roots and stones. These natural fortresses stood 12 feet high and 4 feet thick in places, impenetrable to tanks and artillery alike. When American Shermans tried to scale them, they exposed their weak belly armor, just 1 inch thick. German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns had a field day. In 6 weeks, over 400 Shermans had been destroyed in failed attempts to cross. It was a tactical nightmare. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, age 29, was a cavalryman with the 102nd Reconnaissance Squadron. While others tried explosives and brute force, Cullen studied the problem. The dozer tanks the Army had weren't enough. Too few, too slow, too vulnerable. So Cullen improvised. From the wreckage of German beach defenses, steel check hedgehogs welded to stop landing craft, he cut 4 angled tusks and welded them to the front of a tank. Instead of climbing the hedgerows, his tank would rip through them. For 2 weeks, he tested this device on light tanks. Each time, the metal prongs dug into the base of the hedgerow and punched through, keeping the tank's vulnerable belly protected. The Army took notice. Major Sidney Bingham ordered tests on a full-weight Sherman, more than twice the size of a light tank. Lieutenant Charles Green and his crew volunteered. On July 12th, the first test on a Sherman worked, and so did 4 more. Word reached General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army. He ordered a demonstration for July 13th near St. Lo. Cullen watched nervously as the Sherman equipped with his device charged a towering wall of earth. The impact was deafening, dirt exploding in every direction. The tank didn't climb, it dug and shoved, and in 14 seconds it broke through. Bradley examined the torn hedge and made his decision. He wanted 3,000 of Cullen's devices made in 12 days. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive, depended on it. The task was monumental. The 52nd Ordnance Group began working around the clock. Welders cut steel, torches burned nonstop, and tanks lined up in rows waiting for their modifications. But there were problems. The German steel was harder than expected, torch tips overheated, and only 8 devices were made on day 1. Cullen scrambled to solve the production bottlenecks. He added cooling shifts, brought in reinforcements, and redesigned the mounting system to protect tank suspensions from damage. By July 19th, production increased to 64 devices per day, but the pace was still behind. Bradley needed at least 2,000 Rhino tanks, what troops were beginning to call the modified Shermans. Cullen found more welders, and new steel stockpiles were hauled from Utah Beach. They even began cutting up railroad tracks as substitute steel. Some units, like Green's battalion, used heavier variants nicknamed green dozers. Hybrid production ramped up. By July 23rd, just 2 days before Cobra, over 1,800 devices had been made. Final estimates predicted around 2,300 Rhino tanks would be ready, enough to equip 77% of 1st Army's armored vehicles. It wasn't the 3,000 Bradley wanted, but it was enough. On July 25th, after a massive 90-minute air bombardment that shook the ground from St. Lo to the sea, Operation Cobra began. Rhino tanks led the charge. One by one, they slammed into hedgerows that had stopped Allied tanks for weeks and burst through them in seconds. Radio reports confirmed it. Company B broke through in 16 seconds. Company C crossed 3 hedges in 20 minutes. The Germans, unprepared for this, found their anti-tank tactics useless. Their guns were aimed high, waiting for tanks to climb, not punch through. By mid-morning, American forces had advanced more in 6 hours than they had in the previous 2 weeks. By the afternoon, they were 5 miles inland. Reports of device failures trickled in, about 4 out of every 100. Tanks hitting buried stones or hidden metal posts sometimes lost their prongs or jammed their tracks. Still, the success rate was astonishing. In the following days, the Rhino tanks shattered German lines. Units breached hedgerow after hedgerow. Cullen, exhausted and burned from welding, watched as thousands of tanks he helped modify rolled past. He knew what those steel tusks meant. Thousands of lives saved. Estimates would later show the devices helped prevent the deaths or injuries of 1,500 American crewmen during Cobra alone. On July 28th, the Army formally adopted the design, naming it the Cullen Hedgerow Cutter. Cullen, still a sergeant, returned to field duty, but his invention was everywhere. Bradley's staff issued technical specifications, welders turned the production site into a repair depot, field manuals were updated, crews added variations, some cut the prongs shorter to preserve turret traverse, others added steel teeth for better digging. 4th Armored Division kept their prongs for weeks, so did tank destroyer units. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Bocage faded, but Cullen's cutters remained useful for scattered terrain. By August 5th, the campaign had broken the stalemate. The Rhino tanks had shortened the war in Normandy by over a month. Recognition came slowly. Cullen returned home after the war, married and settled into civilian life. He worked at Shenley Industries, far from tanks and battlefields. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle had written about him during the war. But after the atomic bomb, VE Day and VJ Day, few remembered the hedgerow problem, except the men who survived because of it. General Bradley didn't forget. In 1951, his memoirs praised Cullen by name. He called the device absurdly simple, yet brilliant. The Army's official histories echoed that. The hedgerow cutter became a case study in innovation. At Fort Knox, the Army taught future tank crews how to breach with Cullen's techniques. The field manuals carried his name. NATO adopted the philosophy. Soviet planners studied it and called it an example of capitalist adaptability. Cullen never sought fame. He lived quietly, died in 1963 at age 48, his obituary barely noting his wartime contribution. But 1 year later, on the 20th anniversary of D-Day, President Eisenhower appeared on CBS with Walter Cronkite. In a field near St. Lo, he told the story of a sergeant from New Jersey who solved a problem that baffled generals. He said Cullen's invention helped win the campaign. The interview reached millions. Cullen's legacy now lived in 3 places, in museums like Fort Knox and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where Rhino tanks stand with prongs intact, in military doctrine studied by soldiers from Afghanistan to Iraq, and in the lives of the men who lived because of 4 pieces of welded steel. Most of the original 2,850 devices were scrapped, but the principle endured. When faced with an impossible problem, use what's available, trust initiative, and act with courage. Cullen's idea, born from staring at beach scrap, saved thousands, accelerated victory, and forever changed how armies approached obstacles. His name may not be etched in every history book, but the lives saved and the generations that followed are his true monument.